Father Sirico, thank you for everything you do here, not least for saying everything I was going to say in my speech. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'll get you back for that. Thank you. We kid. We New Yorkers, we like to kid, right? We used to have a lot of Dutch people in New York. You remember that, Father Sirico, about 400 years ago? It's extraordinary. It's extraordinary. And now I realize where they went. So it's incredible. My goodness, there's so many of you, all these Dutch people. If the Spirit falls, I may take the full 90 minutes. I just want you to know. I can say that because I'm not Reformed. I believe in the Holy Spirit working through. Can I say that here? I know there's no Reformed people here. Anything can happen. The Shekinah glory could descend. We could be here for days. Although I think the Scientologists are using the room for a breakfast, so we need to get out. All right, we'll see. We'll see. If I seem tired, and I certainly feel tired, it's because I have been traveling the world. I don't normally travel the world. I believe that I still have a wife and daughter in New York City. But last week I was in Germany. The Bonhoeffer book has been translated into German, and also the Wilberforce books. I was traveling around Germany, and then I went to Albania, and then to Kosovo, and then finally to Greece. My mom is German and my dad is Greek. If you find that funny, don't laugh. It's a very personal issue for me. I asked you not to laugh. Thank you. Thank you. Could I make it clearer? Please don't laugh at that. But I was traveling around, and it's a joy to know that the Bonhoeffer story, I'll tell you about Bonhoeffer in a moment, but it's been translated, the book, into so many languages, now 13, and of course the most important being Dutch. Have I mentioned that it's available in Dutch now? I know, so that's just opened that story up to so many of you here who don't speak English. My goodness. Well, why is the Bonhoeffer story finding audiences around the world? I would like to think it's got something to do with my writing, and by God's grace, it may have something to do with that. But I think it's because it's a story, a true story, except for the chapter I made up, which you never know reading it, but I made it up. No, that's not true. I just want to publicly say that's not true, although you still would never know. But I guess the idea that this is a true story, that it's so inspiring, so real, it's speaking to people's hearts. Obviously, the National Prayer Breakfast was an extraordinary opportunity for me to physically give the book to the current president. And he said to me, we had a brief exchange, and he said to me, "I'm going to read your book." He also said he would cut the debt in half. Did he not say that? Or the deficit? So you know what? I hope that crude political remark will stay in the room. Please. But it's an odd thing because the story of Bonhoeffer does speak, it certainly speaks across the political spectrum. So I just want to tell you the story of Bonhoeffer. If you've heard this before, you can run out and have a cigarette break right now and come back in a few minutes. But can I not joke about cigarettes? Is there something in Grand Rapids? You don't? Weed? Can I joke about weed? Come on. In the Netherlands, man, they're smoking weed all the time. So whatever you do, whatever the Dutch people do when they want to take a break, if you need to, you do what you need to do. I'm not here to judge you. God will judge you. But I'm not here to judge you. By the way, before I begin, let me just say these two tables here, what did you pay for these tables? Because you're uncomfortably close. Could you just move back? Just move it back a little bit. I feel very uncomfortable. You're kind of staring at me. I'm trying to... Okay. I want to talk about my hero, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, tell his story briefly and why I think it's important to us. And I do think it is important, actually very important to many things Father Sirico was saying. So let me start at the beginning. Bonhoeffer was born in 1906 into what must be described, if you've read the book you know, must be described as a spectacular family. You just can't get over, when you read about it, and I did the research, I was stunned. Some leaders and geniuses arise out of a vacuum. You don't know who are the parents of Christopher Columbus or of this one or that one or Mozart, but you think Bonhoeffer arose out of a family that is just so impressive. You can't help but feel slightly jealous when you read about this family. They were all geniuses. His father was the most famous psychiatrist in Germany during the first half of the 20th century. His mother was a genius. All the brothers and sisters were geniuses. His brother, Carl Friedrich, decides to go into physics. Just an example of how smart the Bonhoeffers are. He decides to go into physics, and that means that he split the atom with Max Planck and Albert Einstein. And I was just in Germany recently, and I saw the atom in a museum in Dresden. It's about the size of a softball. Some of you probably didn't know, you probably didn't study the sciences, that atoms were much larger in those days. Much easier to split. He split it with an axe, but he was one of the first. He did it. Einstein was in the room. But that's the kind of family that this was. These were amazing people. So one brother's working with Einstein, the other one goes into law, and becomes the head of the legal department of Lufthansa. So just amazing people, all geniuses. But the father, as a scientist, as a great famous scientist, trained the children to think logically. Trained them. Now, it's one thing to have an incredible IQ, but you can misuse that incredible IQ. You can still think sloppily, just like you can drive sloppily with a powerful engine in your car. You need to train your mind. You need to train your mind to follow the facts, to follow the logic, to understand logic, and to follow an argument relentlessly and rigorously all the way to the end. So they were trained to think clearly, which stood Bonhoeffer in good stead later in his life, and they were trained, finally, and perhaps most importantly, once you know what you think, because of course ideas matter, once you know what you think, you need to be prepared to live that out. What you believe, you may have to live for that. You may have to die for what you believe. So you need to know what you know. You need to know what you believe. You need to think clearly. And so this was the culture of the family, as I say, all geniuses, but all trained to think rigorously and trained to live out what they said they believed. Not to be mere hypocrites and say, oh, I believe these things, but hey, I don't act that way, but that's what grace is for. That covers everything. No, if you really believe it, little laughter for grace, thank you. You know what I mean. You know what I mean. The fact of the matter is that we're supposed to live out what we say we believe. It's our theology, our philosophy is supposed to be consonant with the life that others see. Otherwise, it's obvious we don't really believe those things, isn't it? Well, this is the family he was raised in. At age 14, he boldly announces he wants to be a theologian. He didn't mean he wanted to go into the pastorate or anything. He wanted to distinguish himself in the academic field of theology, which they lived in Berlin. Of course, that was the place on the planet to study theology at that time. So he makes this announcement, and he wants to just be an impressive academic theologian, and that he was. He gets his doctorate in theology at age 21. Anybody here get their doctorate at age 21? Usually in a crowd like this, there's a half a dozen of us. Yeah, actually, I say us. Actually, I didn't get my doctorate at age 21. In fact, I still don't have my doctorate, although I can announce this publicly. I've just begun working earnestly on my honorary doctorate. And I'm really gonna focus now, and I'm gonna get that wrapped up in a few years. So he gets his doctorate at age 21, and the question he's asking and answering on a high academic level is, what is the church? This is the question, what is the church? But he finds, in the course of asking this question and answering it on this high academic level, that he falls in love with the church itself and decides he wants to be ordained as a Lutheran minister. He had to wait till he was 25 for that, so in the meantime, he spent a year in Barcelona, Spain, at a German-speaking congregation in Barcelona, as a vicar there, and then at age 24 decides to come to New York City, where, as I mentioned, I live. He decides to go to New York, principally, I think, for the cultural experience, although being Bonhoeffer, he had to do something, so he decides to enroll as a Sloan Fellow at Union Theological Seminary. Now, Bonhoeffer was not theologically liberal, although he's often been portrayed that way, very falsely, but he was impressed with the liberal theologians at Berlin. He was able to learn from them. Although he disagreed with them fundamentally, he was able to learn great things from them. He was not so impressed by what passed for liberal theology at Union. He was not expecting much in terms of theology at Union, and let's say he was not disappointed. And he was yes, thank you. The point really was that he was not there, it seems to me, ultimately in New York to study theology. He was there for other reasons. What happened to him there was very important, to use the legal term dispositive. He basically was early in his time there. Was September of 1930. He met a fellow student, an African-American from Alabama, who invited Bonhoeffer up to Harlem to visit Abyssinian Baptist Church. Bonhoeffer, being the culturally curious person that he was, the whole family was culturally very sophisticated. They had experienced everything, had read every book, knew music, were geniuses in all these cultural fields. He says, yes, I would love to experience that, and he goes up on a Sunday morning sometime in September of 1930. And what he experiences in this African-American congregation, to cut to the chase, changes his life. He sees a congregation of people who clearly knew suffering. African Americans in 1930, they were not just playing church. This was not about theology. This was not about doing something religious. Clearly, they believed in the God they were obviously worshiping. The music was not just music. They were worshiping a living God. It was a huge congregation. I think it was literally the largest congregation in America at that time. And it was basically an experience that touched Bonhoeffer so deeply, to see people not just playing at church, but actually worshiping God in this visceral, palpable way, that he decides to go back to that church every Sunday that he's in New York. And he went back every Sunday. And it's an amazing thing to think of this tow-headed, bespectacled Berlin academic going up to an African-American church in Harlem every Sunday. But he did that not just to worship, but he also got involved in the lives of the congregation, taught Sunday school there. When he goes back to Germany in the summer of 31, his friends can see that he's different. He's obviously more serious about God. He'd always been serious about theology, always very ambitious. But somehow it seems that he's turned toward God in his heart. It seems that he has determined that he would like to be not just an impressive academic in the field of theology, but to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. He understands somehow that the living relationship with a living God is at the core of everything. And so he begins from behind the lectern at Berlin University, talking about the Bible as a living, breathing thing through which a living God wishes to speak to us. He asks one of his students, "Do you love Jesus?" This was not the kind of thing one would ever hear in Berlin theological circles, where they studied the Bible merely as a historical text. It was an extraordinary thing. Bonhoeffer had changed dramatically. Now, Germany also, during this period, had changed dramatically. When Bonhoeffer left for New York in 1930, the Nazis were the 9th largest political party in the Reichstag. When he came back, they were the 2nd largest political party in the Reichstag, and they were rising very rapidly. Bonhoeffer can sense that Germany is turning toward National Socialism and toward Hitler as a kind of messianic figure to pull them out of the pain and misery of the Versailles Treaty, the Weimar Republic, a very painful time for them. If you've read the book, you know about this, and I didn't know about it, and it was very interesting for me to study and to read, to try to understand really what happened. But you can see why people do these things, and it's very easy for us to say, well, I wouldn't have done that. Yes, you would. You would. Sure you would, and sure I would have. Most people, of course, would have done that, because you only know what you know. You don't know everything. You don't know where things are going. And so Germany turns in this direction, foolishly, follows National Socialism and their leader, and Bonhoeffer from the beginning seems to see where this is going. Now, how did he know that? I think it has to do with the training he got at his father's knee, in thinking clearly, in seeing facts, in forcing one's mind to determine where an argument should go and where it shouldn't go, not to think with one's emotions, but to think really clearly. That's part of it. I also think that there's a mystical quality, maybe not as mystical as Twitter and other social media, which befuddles the father, but maybe not capital M mystery, but lowercase m mystery. There is a kind of a quality in Bonhoeffer, a prophetic quality. And the title of my book is Bonhoeffer, Pastor, Martyr, Prophet, Spy. A prophetic quality. He seems to see what others don't see. And I think this does come from God. This comes from revelation to some extent. He seems to see that Germany is headed for the rocks. He seems to see that Hitler and the Nazis are not what they appear to be, but that they are in fact the enemies of the German church. And so he begins to speak out now, as a very young man, begins to speak out. 2 days after Hitler becomes chancellor, becomes the Führer, right? The German word for leader is Führer. Hitler becomes the Führer. Bonhoeffer goes on the radio 2 days later and gives a famous speech in which he dissects the deeply flawed idea of the Führer principle. This was an idea, a concept of leadership that was very popular in Germany in the early decades of the 20th century, especially once the hash of the Weimar Republic, the democracy, had been kind of forced on Germans who did not understand democracy, weren't really prepared for it, and could certainly see that it was not doing them much good. They wanted to go back to the days of the Kaiser, back to the days when they had strong leadership. That's the German way. And so if you'd ask them what kind of a leader you're looking for, they would say a leader who leads. And as we know, they got one of those. And it didn't work out so well because they really didn't know what they wanted. Well, Bonhoeffer gets on the radio 2 days after Hitler becomes the Führer, the leader, and talks about the true idea of leadership. He says that true leadership, a true leader gets his authority because he's submitted to a higher authority. If you're submitted to a higher authority, you can have legitimate authority. And legitimate authority also, legitimate leadership, is servant leadership. You can tell. That's God's idea of leadership. Jesus washing the feet of his disciples, that's leadership. Jesus dying for his people. This is what leadership does. A parent would die for his children, and that's why he has authority over his children. Bonhoeffer goes into this in this speech. Clearly, this is not Hitler's idea of leadership, but from the very beginning, he's on the record as understanding and explaining publicly what very few are explaining. Bonhoeffer gets involved in the Kirchenkampf, the church battle, because the first thing the Nazis were interested in doing, obviously, is taking over all of society. That's what the totalitarians do. They take over the totality of society. They feel it's a legitimate thing to reorder society along their own ideological lines. But for them, the church was just a part of society. And in Germany, you can see how people would make that mistake, because if the government is allied with the church very closely, if you don't have a tradition of separation of church and state, if you don't understand that, if you don't have a free market system in terms of church, right? You have the government and the state church and so on and so forth. Well, then it's very easy to see how once a new leader comes in that he's going to do that legitimately. And so you're going to let him do that if you don't know that it can lead to bad things. But Bonhoeffer seems to see right away that the Nazis are trying to take over the church, that the government is encroaching on the sphere of the church. And immediately he sees this and begins to speak out against this. At one point he makes the statement, in Germany we can only have one, Christians in Germany can only have one Savior, and that is Jesus Christ. He makes it very clear, very pointed, not incendiary, but pointed, that he's talking about the current regime. And basically, the Nazis did try to take over the church. It's an extraordinary thing. Not that that could ever happen again, of course. We've figured that out. The government will never encroach on the church again, because we just know it didn't work out, and so they wouldn't even try. Now, who'd be foolish enough to even think that could happen in our modern day and age? He said bitterly. So Bonhoeffer begins to try to warn his fellow Germans, to try to warn his fellow German Christians about what is happening. Because, of course, the Nazis were trying to order everything along racial lines, right? Their whole reality, they saw everything through the lens of race. So to be German was good, to be Jewish was bad. So they were trying to, and this is true, trying to create a German church that was utterly devoid of all Jewish influence. Good luck with that project. It's an extraordinary thing. It's comical to one extent, and then it's deeply, deeply tragic and evil when you think about it. But this is true. They thought we can reorder the church and create the church in our own image, so to speak. We'll just continue to call it Christianity because, we already own the buildings and stuff. We don't want to have to create a whole new thing, so we'll just gut it from the inside and do what we like. And of course, that will never happen again either, right? We've got that worked out. So this idea of reinventing the Christian faith, but saying that we still want it to be the church, because we know that if we were to say that we're against the church, which the Nazis were deeply, profoundly, committedly against serious Christian faith. But if they were to say that, of course, they would lose all their political capital. They couldn't say that, so they had to sort of fool Germans into thinking that they're on board, and they would use God language and so on and so forth. But clearly, they were the enemies of the Christian faith. In the book, there's a whole chapter on what the Nazis really believed, and it's fascinating to see how they played along, because they understood that they've got to amass power. They can't just announce themselves as enemies of the Christian faith, because they can use the church and they can infiltrate the church, and that's what they're doing. Bonhoeffer, from the beginning, is in the forefront of battling this. In 1934, a number of folks finally realized that the German church is being taken over, and the state church is now Nazified, effectively, and so they need to separate from the state church. And it's a fascinating thing, because in our world and in mainline Protestantism, we'll sort of play patty cake and have committees and stuff. It goes on for decades, really. But in 1 year, these serious Christians said, this is wrong, and we are going to separate, and they had this status confessionis. A moment comes where they said, that's it, and we're going to publicly distance ourselves, separate from the German state church, which has been overtaken by the Nazis, and they formed what became known as the Confessing Church, famous Barmen Declaration, which today I would say has a kind of parallel in the Manhattan Declaration. I don't know if anybody here knows what that is, but if you don't, go to manhattandeclaration.org and yeah, thank you. Look it up, because there comes a time when you need to see what is happening and speak up. Where it will be too late. So Bonhoeffer is speaking up, but even with the formation of the Confessing Church, he has a sense that even his allies don't really get it. They don't see the extent to which the Nazis are trying to take over the church. The speed and the ruthlessness of the Nazis was something that, frankly, people weren't prepared for. It was a civilized society, and they simply didn't think it'd go as far as it did. But somehow Bonhoeffer sees where it's going, and there's an urgency that he has, and this is always true of prophets. They see something that others don't see, and they try to warn the others, and it's like out of some 1950s horror film, right? That one person sees something, and they try to tell their friends, and the friends go, oh, come on. Well, that's the sense you get, really, that Bonhoeffer is trying to wake up the church to see that the Nazis are not done. They're going to encroach and encroach and encroach, that it just seems a millimeter now, but eventually it'll be a yard, and then eventually a meter. And so that's a little metric joke to keep you on your toes at this late hour. So Bonhoeffer is trying to wake up his fellow Germans to say that you need to understand we have a window where we can fight. We have a window. And if we don't have all of our soldiers on this line fighting with everything we have now, tomorrow we won't have enough soldiers. The battle will be over. Now is the time to fight. And he tried hard to rally the troops. And when I say the troops, I mean the church. He tried to say our religious liberty and all of our liberty, because there's a slight connection between religious liberty and liberty, just a slight connection. We don't want to go into that. But our liberty is being threatened. And if we allow the Nazis to take over, to push government into where the church rightly stands, in a moment, we will no longer have the ability even to fight. So we must fight with everything we have now. This is an all-hands-on-deck moment. The window is closing. When I wrote the book, I wasn't thinking of the parallels to where we are today. And of course, people immediately leap to saying that, well, are you calling the president Hitler, or are you saying whatever? If you think a little deeply, you realize, no. But that doesn't mean there still can't be parallels. And the parallel of the government encroaching on the sphere of the church, it is a disturbing and unfortunately very real parallel, especially in this country where we have a tradition and a history of religious freedom that is so unparalleled. I would say that because of our embarrassment of riches when it comes to religious freedom, we take it for granted. Isn't that the case? If you're a fish, you don't know that you're wet. We have been swimming in such religious freedom in this glorious nation that when it begins to be taken away, we're not even sure what it is. What do you mean, religious freedom? Well, this HHS mandate, obviously, this is a classic example of it's just a millimeter, it's just a little bit. But we have to understand, as Americans, it's a principle, and it is a deeply grievous thing when we say, well, we don't really have principles. It's just a millimeter, we don't care. No, there are some lines which you must not cross. If that line is being crossed, we're in a new era. And I think that the same thing falls with the legal redefinition of something like marriage. You say, well, and this is how I always think of Bonhoeffer. You have to think it through logically to the end. Don't think with your emotions. Don't say, well, it's not going to affect me or what. You can love people with whom you profoundly disagree, and we are called, nay, commanded by the God we serve to love our enemies, political and otherwise. But we must also think things through. And the concept of religious freedom will be profoundly and probably fatally harmed if in this nation, on these two issues, we don't fight with everything we have. There comes a moment, as I say, when you're going to notice that the bullets don't work anymore. And I think that Bonhoeffer, the story, one of the reasons it speaks so powerfully is because people sense these kinds of parallels, and this is just one I wanted to highlight. And it is, in fact, disturbing because you realize that things are always different and they're always the same. If you draw the parallels too closely, it gets ridiculous. Nonetheless, there are some parallels here. This issue of religious freedom, Bonhoeffer knew that this will be the end of Germany. And why don't my allies, the good guys, the members of the Confessing Church, why don't they see this and understand that we've got to fight with everything we have now, right now? We won't be able to fight tomorrow. But somehow he failed to do this. In 1935, he goes off to lead an illegal seminary. It's kind of the golden age of Bonhoeffer. I won't go into that now. But he's trying to train young men. What does it mean to be an obedient disciple of Jesus Christ? Not just to be a cleric. This is not a seminary where we're just going to teach you how to do a little exegesis and run a liturgy and go ahead. You can have a church. And no, he said we've got to be disciples of Jesus Christ. There's something deeper. We've got to have a personal relationship. So he did this for a number of years. Out of it comes his famous book, Gemeinsames Leben, which translated into English is, I think it's Horton Hears a Who. I may be getting that wrong. I always get this mixed up. I'm a little jet lagged. But no, it's Life Together. I'm sorry. I always get them mixed up. Life Together, the golden era, as far as I'm concerned, of Bonhoeffer, where he's training scores and scores of young men. What does it mean to be disciples of Jesus Christ? But his ability to serve God in Germany, as the German church, as he was warning, is being encroached upon by the government day by day by day by day. His ability to serve God becomes diminished, increasingly diminished. Eventually, the Gestapo shuts down Finkenwalde, which is this illegal seminary. Bonhoeffer takes the training underground, but eventually they catch up with that. You understand that the Nazis weren't content to say, we'll just go this far and no farther. They would push and push and push and push until they had such advantage that there was no fighting them. In 1938, Bonhoeffer knows war is coming. He understands he doesn't have the freedom to fight in this war. This is not a war he would be willing to pick up arms. And he was not a pacifist. I think a lot of times he's falsely portrayed as a standard Vietnam-era pacifist, as though had he lived, he would have been the third person in the bed with John and Yoko. That is, you just dated yourself by chuckling at that. I just want you to know. Notice the children. Who's John and Yoko? Who? What? Your parents will explain later. They were a hot pop group, Plastic Ono band, very big at one time. But where were we? So Bonhoeffer's not a standard era pacifist, but he knows he cannot fight in a war of aggression. He cannot fight in Hitler's war. By the way, the Nazis prohibited him not just from teaching, but then from speaking publicly and then from publishing, because he had the temerity to write a book on the Old Testament Psalms. The Old Testament at this time, as I said earlier, was considered a little bit too Jewish. And Now that you mention it, it is kind of Jewish, isn't it? Yeah, it's very Jewish. Well, the Nazis said no. We're gonna get rid of the Old Testament, and so they're recreating this pseudo-Christianity, neo-paganism, of course. But Bonhoeffer writes a book on the Psalms, and so he becomes unable to even publish. So he's wondering, what am I going to do now? The war's coming. He certainly is not going to be able to fight in this war of aggression. He will not fight. What can he do? Well, he decides to escape to America again, to go to New York. Long story short, he gets on a ship in June of 1939, and no sooner is he on this ship than he begins to sense that he's made a mistake, that somehow he's missed God. And again, he has this living personal relationship with Jesus. He's praying, he's asking God to lead him, and he has a sense that he's missed God, that somehow he ought not to be going to America. And 26 days later, he gets on another ship after he's landed in New York Harbor, and he goes back. He decides God has called him to return to stand with his people. Now, to go back is to go back to certain danger and perhaps death, but he really felt that God had called him to do this. And Bonhoeffer was the kind of guy who, if he feels God's called him to do something, he's smart enough to know that that's what I need to do. And so he goes back. Now, the question is, what was he going to do when he went back? Well, what he did, it's where it gets a little crazy. Now, if you've read the book, you know the story. He becomes a spy, a double agent. His brother-in-law, Hans von Dohnanyi, was one of the leaders of German military intelligence, the Abwehr, so-called Abwehr. And the Abwehr, German military intelligence, was at the very center of the plot against Adolf Hitler. It was not widely known. That's how you know it's a conspiracy. And so Bonhoeffer is hired by his brother to join the Abwehr, to join military intelligence, to look like he's going to be serving the Third Reich in time of war. We've got to rally around and defend the fatherland. But in fact, what he was going to do is officially become a member of this conspiracy against Adolf Hitler. He does that. Now, what was he going to do specifically in that conspiracy? He had wide contacts across Europe in the church, ecumenical contacts. He'd been in London. He knew many people across Europe, and ostensibly he could, as a member of German military intelligence, use those contacts to further the aims of the Third Reich, travel to neutral countries. But what he was actually going to do was travel to those neutral countries to make secret contact with members of the Allied governments, most notably the Churchill government, to let them know there are Germans inside Germany working against Hitler and the Nazis. In 1942, Bonhoeffer falls in love. I won't tell that story, but I had the privilege to tell that story in the book, an extraordinary love story which really hadn't been told before. I'm kind of amazed to say that, but it's true. He gets engaged, but no sooner does he get engaged until 1943, April, he's arrested. Now, why is he arrested? For his involvement in the plot to kill Hitler? No, this had not yet been discovered. He is arrested for his involvement in something called Unternehmen 7, Operation 7, so-called, because it was a plot to get 7 Jews out of Germany and into neutral Switzerland to save their lives. He was involved in that. He was implicated in that. So he's arrested and sent to Tegel military prison. But Tegel military prison was not so bad. A lot of the military cast were anti-Hitler. They couldn't say so publicly, obviously, but he was treated reasonably well there. He had great hopes that he would win his case, fool the prosecutor, and get out, or that the Allies would win the war and he would survive that way, or the conspirators who were still outside would in fact succeed in killing Hitler. But of course, we know that didn't happen. The final attempt to kill Hitler, and I write about them all in the book. It's fascinating to me, these attempts which come so close but don't succeed. The last one is July 20th, 1944. Some of you know the story, the Valkyrie plot, the briefcase bomb von Stauffenberg. The bomb goes off. Finally, the bomb goes off, but it fails to kill Hitler and consequently exposes the conspiracy for the first time in all the years that it's been going on. So thousands are now arrested, tortured, names come up. One of the names at the top of the list is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. From here on in, you get the idea that Bonhoeffer's days are in fact numbered. He's transferred to Buchenwald, actually first to the Gestapo prison, then to Buchenwald. And then in April of 1945, right before the end of the war, transferred to Flossenburg concentration camp, where on the direct orders of Hitler, he's executed at dawn, April 9th. Now, most of us are tempted to think of this as merely tragic, merely sad. If you miss the sadness of it, you miss a big part of it. But if that's all you see, you miss the bigger picture. It's sort of Bonhoeffer, I guess, would be the first in line to rebuke you and to say, I did not go to the gallows wringing my hands. I was obeying God all the way to the end. And this is fascinating and true, that he was all the way through hearing from God, being led by God to do what he did, including to get involved in this conspiracy. And so he went to the gallows, and we have proof of this, and if you've read the book, you see that he did not go wringing his hands, saying, oh, if only I had done this, if only I had done that. No, he had a sense that God had led him to this place. In 1933, 12 years before his death, he gives a sermon. I closed the book with this, and I'll close now. He gives a sermon in 1933, 12 years before his death, in which he talks about death itself. And he says that death is the most terrible thing imaginable unless it's transformed by faith in the God of Scripture. And Bonhoeffer, preaching to his staid Lutheran congregation that day, talks about this and says that if you've ever come to know the God of Scripture, and if you call yourself a Christian, then you're somebody who ought to actually know the God of Scripture, not just know about him, but know him. If you've ever glimpsed the kingdom of heaven, he says, you are from that moment homesick to be with God in that place. You know that that's your true home. This is not just an idea. This is truth. This is reality. And that if we don't know that, frankly, life is too hard not to know that. But if you know that, it transforms everything. Bonhoeffer preaches that in 1933, and when he goes to the gallows in 1945, it's obvious that he believes it all the more strongly that this thing that he believes is true. It's not something we hope is true. We know it's true. And because we know that it is in fact true, it gives us hope. So when everything is bleak, when we're going to the gallows, or when we're simply going through difficulty and pain, when things look bleak, people say, well, do you have hope? People often ask me, well, how do you feel? You look at the situation today, do you have hope? I have to say ultimately, and ultimately it's kind of a big word, it's an important word. Ultimately, my hope is in Jesus Christ, not in circumstances, not in political victories. So you fight for what is right, and you fight with everything you have, and you fight God's way. You don't fight as the world fights. We're obliged to love our enemies, even as we're passionately fighting against them. We must speak civilly. That's a command if you're a Christian. But ultimately, our hope is not in circumstances or in elections or in these kinds of victories. Ultimately, our hope is in the one who died for us, who is real, who is life itself, who is truth itself. This is a very important thing for people of faith to know, because if your hope is genuinely in him, it changes everything. It makes it easier to deal with defeat. It doesn't mean to concede. Never. Never. We never will concede against untruth and injustice. Never. But you realize that your hope is in him. And if your hope is in him, it makes it that much easier to fight the battle, because you fight with hope. We need to have hope. I think somehow in the story of Bonhoeffer, God has given me more hope, and has given a lot of people, as I go talking around the country, hope to know that God wants us, expects us to live like that. We're not meant to look at that and think, well, that's a especially holy guy and I can't reach that standard. Not according to God, who made you and who may know better than you what you're capable of. And the one who made you in his image knows that he made you for that kind of a life. And so he's given us stories like the story of Bonhoeffer to inspire us to much greater commitment, which frankly is easier. We think it's difficult. No, it's easier. When you're doing the thing that God Almighty created you to do, it's ultimately easier. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. I think somehow the model of Bonhoeffer is capable of inspiring us, and that we don't need, like the German church, to miss what God is saying, that somehow we can hear it again through Bonhoeffer and that by God's grace, we, the American church, the church in the West, may this time heed the prophet's warning. That's my prayer, and my hope is in the one to whom I pray always. God bless you. Thank you.